The notice of motion, Racism Not Welcome campaign. Councillor Huang, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, councillors. It is a great pleasure to put forward this motion once again. About 10 months ago, Cumberland City Council became the only council in Australia that voted against the Racism Not Welcome campaign. People around the chamber are well aware of my encounter with racism last year. It was a horrible experience, not only for me, but also for my family and the community. I wouldn't wish anyone else to go through what I went through. Shocking data, being physically threatened or attacked because of their Chinese heritage, has been called an offensive names because they were Chinese of heritage, and threatened differently or less favourably, treated differently or less favourably because of their background. This shocking statistic shows by those who see multiculturalism perhaps as a barrier to their own success. Racism be a racist. Racism, please be a racist. Racist, a racist. No racism in Cumberland. We do have a problem in Cumberland. You just need to speak with some of our community members. With racism, a shop owner in Auburn told me that he was racially abused for calling AF Chinese and go back to your country. It is no longer good enough to be a non-racist. We all need to be anti-racist. If you don't take a strong stance to condemn the abuse, you enable it. If we don't take a strong stance condemning the racism, we are helping to enabling it. Culturally and linguistic diverse community.
Diversity, inclusiveness, multiculturalism, the racism not welcome, the existence of racism in our community, incidents of racism. There is certain level of racism in our community. Validate people's experience with racism. Racism do exist in our community. About the racism. And put our name down for a progressive council, an inclusive council, a council where everyone is welcomed. First Nation people, injustice they experienced. For Australians, for us, there is urgency to address the reduced life expectancy of all Indigenous people, their increased likelihood of experiencing poor health, poverty, a lower standard of education, and even deaths in custody. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians continue to face discrimination on both an institutional and interpersonal level today. It's not only the Indigenous Australians who are facing discrimination in our country, in our community. We have seen a disturbing increase in racism directed at people of Asian backgrounds, racism, diversity and inclusion. For those who think there is no racism in Cumberland City, let me tell you, friends, unfortunately it does exist. Stop racism in Cumberland. To send a message to the people that racism is not welcome at Cumberland. It will empower the victim to start a conversation. Racism not welcome, racism not welcome.
Madam Mayor, I oppose the motion. I might ask the General Manager, could he advise the Chamber roughly how much correspondence has been received to Council on racism issues?
I honestly couldn't tell you, to be perfectly honest with you. I honestly couldn't tell you.
If it was a big issue, someone in the department would have raised it at your executive meetings at some stage?
We, by way of correspondence, if you're asking specifically about correspondence, I certainly haven't received any to my office or to my staff that I'm aware of specifically in terms of correspondence about racism. Anything beyond that, I'd have to look into.
We have frequent meetings with the police, Mr. General Manager. Have they raised the issue of racism at those meetings as a major problem or a problem at all?
I can't recall any specific instances, but to be sure, I'd have to go back and reflect on the notes.
Well, that answer supports other correspondence that I know has been received when we've gone to the two most local police commands, and they've indicated to us that they haven't received any complaints either, and it doesn't rate as one of the major issues that we have within our local community. Look, I support the statement, racism not welcome. I think it's a motherhood statement. I know that we only stopped the White Australia policy in this country in 1957. You know, that's not that long ago, I suppose, in terms of the evolution of a growth of a country. I know racism did exist, and I know in some places in Australia it probably does. But if we're talking about, if our stamp of authority is to talk about Cumberland, I'm afraid that I can't really say that it's been identified as a major problem. Are there racists within Cumberland? Undoubtedly so. Right? Are there people that have got away with murder in Cumberland? Undoubtedly. There'd be somebody out there. Right? Those situations exist. It's part of human nature, sadly. You can't just expect everyone to be a victim. You know, I suppose in our own way, we're all victims of some sort of discrimination within society, promoting this policy about racism. If I was wearing a T-shirt, I think I'd be wearing one which celebrates the cosmopolitan nature of our wonderful community. The fact that we have a community that's made up of so many nations on earth, and we have such a wonderful, cohesive community. That's what I'd be celebrating. I don't think we need to celebrate the fact, highlight the fact that there's racists out there. We all know that. And if you go to some other places in Australia, they're full of racists, sadly. What do they say? Wide lawns, narrow minds?
But my statement was that Cumberland Council is the only council in Australia that had voted against the motion.
I have a question to the Deputy Mayor HUANG. With roughly 62% of Cumberland's citizens being of ethnic background, can you identify to me where you perceive the racism is coming in and who's being racist to who?
Racism exists amongst different ethnic groups. It amounts everywhere.
Can you identify where this is coming from? You're moving.
He's answered your question. He says it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
Is it? Okay. Well, look, quite frankly, I'm going to state from the outset, okay? Mayor Lake, I'm going to sit down until you declare some order over there. They keep speaking while I'm talking. Again.
No interruptions, thank you.
I have my time reset too, please.
We're coming towards the end of the evening. Let's allow Councillor CHRISTOU to speak. Thank you.
Again? Cool.
Look, I'm disappointed. Now, I'm going to say this from the outset. I'm a child of Greek Cypriot refugees. They came here as refugees from Cyprus after losing their home. Now, growing up, I experienced many names. I got called a wog. Definitely during lockdown, I got called up and said, you and your wog residents, on countless of occasions, but you and your wog residents are the reason we're all in lockdown and we've got restrictions. I'm not out there crying victimhood like some seem to in this chamber, and it's very concerning because we're doing our residents a disservice. Our residents expect us to come here and give them some options, give them some solutions. How we're going to help them? Pay the mortgage, the rent, the bills, put food on the table. But all we have from those opposite is victimhood. And quite frankly, in my opinion, have some respect with the way you represent your community and your attire. I've never seen an elected representative not calm. I'm not getting personal, it's my opinion. And I'm entitled to it because I can see what you're going to say. Come to the chamber, okay, not dressed suitably. Quite frankly, I'm just perplexed. Councillor Saha, I can now see why your number 2 has become the mayor over you when you support such motions. It's, you know, it's just, the mind boggles. We're not offering anything to our community other than me, and victimhood. Councillor HUANG, correct me if I'm wrong, through you, Madam Mayor. Through the election campaign, it was put to me that you...
My point of order is 1511D. Councillor CHRISTOU make a personal reflection on me, which is not true. So I request him to withdraw and apologise.
Well, what wasn't true, Councillor Saha?
Oh,
what was the personal reflection?
You just said...
You wasn't good enough to be the mayor.
Yes, that's...
I said that's my opinion. I said I can now see.
So that's the personal reflection.
That's not a personal reflection. That's just a reality.
I mean, the mayor needs to rule it out.
Yeah, I rule against the point of order. I'll ask Councillor CHRISTOU to continue.
Thank you. At the end of the day, all right, we need to stop the whinging and complaining, people. Councillors, our residents deserve better. Come to this chamber and work out ways how you're going to help your community. Nobody condones racism. Nobody. Not me. Not anyone on this side of the chamber. Not anyone on that side of the chamber. But coming here tonight, dressed in your racism not welcome shirts, and yes, we're going to put up some street signs. But how's that really helping our community? It's not helping our community pay their mortgage, their rent, their bills, put food on the table, educate their children. That's what our community wants from us. Not this stuff, but keep going the way you are.
Acknowledge the existence of racism and validate people's lived experience and normalise the conversations about racism. I wanted to speak to some experiences that I have had in my capacity as a councillor, as a woman with, albeit some power, that in fact, it was a councillor in this chamber who went to the media and made misrepresentations of me wanting to cut Australia Day funding. Now, can I tell you, it was absolutely misrepresentation, and council dealt with it really quickly by putting a media statement out there about it. But can I tell you the racism that I endured in response to that? One man told me that he was going to strangle me with my hijab. Strangle me with my hijab. Another man told me, and I'm going to articulate this particular one and then I won't disturb you anymore, because this was read out to me, unfortunately, on my social media account by my then, I think, 8-year-old son, who read to me while I was driving. Mummy, somebody says, what is the word? Of course, as a mother, I thought, oh my God, what are you doing on that screen? And then he reads, I am going to shove a sharp dagger up your Muslim. That is the racism that I received because of a really pathetic remark that was made in the media that was designed to dog whistle and to incite this kind of behaviour. So can I say to people listening today that the standard that we walk by is a standard that we accept, and I encourage each and every single person to call it out, to talk about it in order to normalise it. If you can, of course, I accept that some people can't. We don't need to stop the whinging, Councillor CHRISTOU. We need to stop the racism.
When I look at this notice of motion, and I think back to 8 or 10 months ago when it came before council, it was voted down at that point. And whilst it was voted down, it wasn't because we didn't agree with that, with the fact that racism lives within the Australian society, because it does. I was born and bred in Australia, and I'm an Australian through and through. Yet I get called an ethnic, a WUG, a Leb, and every other name you can think of under the sun. I mean, if you just want to go back to recent times, and I think Councillor Coleman was standing next to me at polling, at pre-poll, she's nodding her head, where one woman came up to me and said, I'm not voting for you, you effing this and that. Why don't you go back to where you came from? I said, I was born and bred here, I don't know what you're talking about. She said, go back to Auburn, to the mosque that you came from. And I said, you've got the wrong guy, but hey, I'm not asking you to vote for me. I'll live my life, you live yours. We don't have room for people like you here. Now, in saying that, yes, racism lives well and truly in Cumberland, as it does in Australia. Do I think that this racism not welcome campaign is the way to go about it. I don't believe it is. I don't believe it is. That's my personal opinion, and I believe I speak on behalf of a lot of people in saying that and expressing that. There are other ways to go about it. The fact that you may be Chinese, or I might be of Lebanese descent, sorry, I'll change it, that you might be of Chinese descent, or I might be of Lebanese descent, as is Councillor RAHME, Zayda, Hussein, Hamid, or Bangladeshi descent. Regardless of where you come from, we bring our own unique cultures here and our own points of view. Does that mean that we run a campaign that others are running? I think that we can stand on our own 2 feet and fend for ourselves. I don't think that we need to jump on this bandwagon. And now, point 4 says allocate $5,000 from media budget towards the campaign. And I acknowledge it's not going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, but I don't believe that $5,000 would cover the cost of printing signs and then having the manpower go out there.
We have the most diverse community. We have to be inclusive. I do have a lot of friends. There are a range of cultures, and I never get complaints from them about receiving any sort of racist comments. I would recommend an amendment that doesn't only cover racism, but also discrimination, and sadly some aspects that had already been brought up in this chamber previously. Things such as age discrimination, gender discrimination, even disability rights, and that's just to name a few. So any such signage should be racism and discrimination.
I'm wholeheartedly against any form of racism and discrimination. I think the amendment encapsulates a broader potential problem in our LGA and in Australia, because alienating someone goes beyond racism in my eyes and can be based on religious beliefs or other forms of discrimination. So if the principle of this chamber is to eradicate the problem and not just to score brownie points, which I'm not suggesting that's what they're doing, adding the word discrimination would not be a problem. Now, I've still got WhatsApp messages that I can show of physical death threats that have come to me because I've had differing views to a particular ethnic group and a particular group, and I'm happy to show them to anyone because I've kept them all. And my initial investigations would tell me that a lot of that was fueled potentially by people in this chamber. So, and I'm happy to show those WhatsApp messages. So I've been a victim of racism and discrimination my whole life. Have I moved on? That's just how I've chosen to deal with it. I'm not saying that moving on is how everyone should deal with it, but people deal with things in different ways. I don't think signs are going to educate someone who is likely to offend or be racist or discriminate.
Allocate the funds towards workshops to combat racism, racist behaviour.
Yeah. And let me tell you, a lot of the discrimination and racism I face are actually from the councils that we're talking about.
Let me just get the wording.
And I hope those opposite, especially the new councillors that have been on their phone, were paying enough attention to actually hear and understand what Councillor Hughes was saying. During my time as mayor, which was just over 2 years and 3 months, I never once got one phone call or correspondence from people complaining to me about this, about racism in general. Okay, but what I did get in return was my wife and daughters plastered on a very prominent Facebook page, calling them about their picture, calling them a fill in the blank. All right, so putting racism not welcome signs is just not going to fix this problem. As Councillor RAHME alluded to, we need to try and run education sessions and discrimination as well. This is what it's about. And quite frankly, those opposite need to stop their own dog whistling and appealing to certain sections of the community they think is going to benefit them, and actually come to this chamber and offer some solutions. If you are really intent in doing something for your community, support the amendment because it goes broad. Because if you knock it, if you knock it down, it just proves you're just dog whistling and playing politics.
Madam Mayor, let me tell you my own experience. I was subject to a very, very tough racial verbal abuse in this council chamber last year. I called it out, the person apologized, and I moved on. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that Racism Not Welcome campaign and its fundamentals are not necessarily based on increased incidents of racism, but is about an acknowledgement that the racism exists in our community.
So I think everyone here spoke about the racism they faced, and I absolutely agree. And I went through the same thing. And as Councillor Saha said, no one reported. All of the councillor said that they went through it. I went through it. In Barella Station during the campaign, I was told, how dare you ask for Australian vote wearing hijab? I mean, very recent one. And there are so many incidents. So it is there in Cumberland Council. It is there everywhere.
The movers of this motion, what are they trying to achieve in that $5,000 will probably get them coverage on about maybe 6, 7 streets, maybe 8 streets on both sides? Firstly, how are we going to gauge whether this particular campaign works, doesn't work? Are we going to get feedback? How do we propose to actually get any indication or response back from our community or back to council in respect to how this campaign is working? Who decides where these street signs go? How long is this campaign going to go for? When's the end date?
In terms of the costs, 40 signs, I have a quote for 40 signs for $2,900.
Yep, and what's the installation cost?
Sorry?
And what's the installation cost?
Installation cost. Can I forward that question to the relevant director?
As the resourcing implications identified in the notice of motion, we'd use existing staff for that, and then I'd have to determine the staff time to look at the signs and their locations to determine the cost of that, so it would have to be on a merit basis after the locations have been identified.
I've got a question.
Sorry. Through you, Madam Mayor. That doesn't actually answer the question. Okay, that doesn't actually answer the question, because the response that we got from Councillor Huang in respect to my first question was that $2,000 for 40 street signs. So what would it cost to install 40 street signs in our local area?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I'd have to take that on notice to identify the staffing costs and resources for 40 signs.
So I would assume that if it costs more than $5,000, you won't install 40 signs. You're only going to install up to $5,000 worth of signs.
That's right.
That would be correct.
Okay. Based on how many signs you're saying, 40 street signs?
It's within the budget. Look, it's within the budget.
I don't care about the budget. $5,000 neither here nor there. Okay. It's more.
It's allocated $5,000. Why are you laughing?
Councillor, please. Councillor, can I just finish, please?
Just keep the conversation with Councillor Zada. Councillor Christian.
I actually want to answer these questions.
No, I want to answer too, but sorry.
So, Councillor Zada, please continue.
The second question was in respect to the. What was it now? I thought. First, was the cost.
Yes.
Okay.
How long the campaign will go for? Look.
Well, how are you going to gauge the benefits or the benefits of the campaign? How long is the campaign going to go for? So, do you want to answer maybe how are you going to gauge whether the campaign is successful or not? What are the KPIs for it?
Well, I guess the KPI for it is the.
Are we going to get a report
sentiment.
back? How are we going to do that within $5,000 budget?
I guess the campaign will go for as long as we eliminate racism from this country.
Well, that's not going to happen. Okay.
Well, let's work towards it.
Okay. Well, that's not going to happen.
Councillor Huang, if you don't have to answer any question, you're not obliged.
No, I know. Look, I'll.
So you haven't thought it through. You haven't thought it through.
Come on.
Look, it is hard. I'm being quite honest.
No, because
with you.
I thought about it.
No, it is quite honest. I'm being quite honest with you. I'm trying to answer this honestly, and not like someone trying to play politics here. It is quite hard to gauge, but ultimately it is about the community sentiment, and we want to test it by looking at the community sentiment feedback from this campaign.
So we're going to vote on the amendment. All those in favour of the amendment, please raise their hand. Councillor Garrard, Councillor CHRISTOU, Councillor Hughes, Councillor SARKIS, Councillor Zeta and Councillor RAHME. Those against the amendment, please raise their hand. Councillor FAROOQUI, Councillor ELMORE, Councillor HUSSEIN, Councillor Mohamad, Councillor COLMAN, Councillor Saha, Councillor HUANG and Councillor Lake. The amendment has been lost. I now put the original motion. All those in favour of the HUANG Saha motion, please raise their hands. They're all standing up. Okay. Councillor FAROOQUI, Councillor ELMORE, Councillor HUSSEIN, Councillor Mohamad, Councillor COLMAN, Councillor Saha, Councillor HUANG and Councillor Lake and Councillor RAHME and Councillor Zeta. All those against the original motion, please raise your hand. Councillor Garrard, Councillor CHRISTOU, Councillor Hughes, Councillor RAHME and Councillor SARKIS. The motion is carried.